Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another episode of How to Speak Victorian. Today I'm going to be talking about a broad category which within Victorian culture and society would probably be called men of letters. Basically today I'm going to be talking about essayists, non-fiction writers and journalists and editors kind of people within the Victorian period, people who were involved in literature and who wrote a lot of non-fiction but didn't necessarily write fiction as well. Some of these writers I'm going to be speaking about did also write fiction, but I'm going to be focusing on their important kind of non-fiction contributions as well to the Victorian society. I will link down below all previous episodes of How to Speak Victorian. As I did with my episodes on the novelists and the poets of the Victorian period, I'm going to go through in alphabetical order some of the key important non-fiction writers in the Victorian period. I don't know Victorian non-fiction as well as I know Victorian novels, so do obviously look up things yourself if you would like to. Most of my knowledge and information here comes either from stuff I've picked up from reading various bits of non-fiction here and there, or from my studying the Victorian period at university. One other useful resource I have used a lot is this book here, which is Culture and Society in Britain 1850 to 1890. This is basically a book of sources of writing from the Victorian period, mostly non-fiction but also some poetry and novel extracts as well, and this was set on one of the history modules I did at university on the Victorian period, and is really interesting, has a lot of fascinating sources in it, a lot of fascinating pieces of non-fiction writing or extracts from non-fiction writing, which is where a lot of my information for today's video comes from. Another really useful website to look at is victorianweb.org, which I will link down below, which is just a fascinating website full of so much Victorian information. So let's start off with Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold was born in 1822 and died in 1888. He was a poet as well as a non-fiction writer, and I have already spoken about him and his poetry in my Victorian poets video. But he did also write a lot of important non-fiction within the Victorian period. One of the most important works is something called Culture and Anarchy, which was published in 1869, which deals with the importance of culture and of kind of, not exactly necessarily highbrow culture, but for the most part highbrow culture and literature and art as being like the study of perfection, and why culture is so important in kind of morality and in human existence. He also wrote a kind of criticism of the middle classes and of the kind of cult of the middle classes that existed in the Victorian period, the idealisation of the middle classes. He wrote a critique of this in 1871 called Friendship's Garland. He wrote many essays and long or non-fiction works throughout the Victorian period, often focusing on religion, on culture, on the role of art and literature in society, and also on the role and the relationship between different classes. Next, I want to speak about Isabella Beaton, more often known as Mrs. Beaton. She was born in 1836 and died in 1865, and she was the author of Household Management and various other cookery and household management books. She may seem like an odd person to include in a list of non-fiction writers in the Victorian period, but actually she's very significant. One, in that her cultural impact on Victorian society, especially on Victorian women, is huge. Like, she was where you learned how to make house. She was the person who you went to for your recipes and to know how to clean, to know how to cook, to know how to talk to your servants. She was the pinnacle of middle class respectability in terms of how to run a household, but also how to clean, how to cook, how to do so many things that were required in the running of a house. She was incredibly important throughout the Victorian period as a writer, especially for women, and is incredibly important today in terms of telling us so much more about Victorian everyday life and household management. Next, Thomas Carlyle. Thomas Carlyle was born in 1795 and died in 1881. Thomas Carlyle still remains quite famous as a Victorian man of letters, as an essayist and also a writer both of non-fiction in general but also of history. He wrote an interesting history of the French Revolution, which I think is the only of his longer works that I've read all the way through, which is really interesting. It's especially interesting if you like Dickens's Tale of Two Cities, because Dickens's interpretation of the French Revolution is basically Carlyle's interpretation of the French Revolution, but in a novel form rather than in a history. At university I actually wrote an essay comparing Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities and Thomas Carlyle's A History of the French Revolution. I enjoyed that I managed to get Dickens into the history half of my degree as well, but that was great fun. Thomas Carlyle is a really interesting writer, both in terms of the way he looks at the French Revolution and history, but also in his writing on current things. He writes a lot about like the condition of England question, his worries about industrialisation, about social problems, about the fact that society is changing so fast and that the way that classes are separated, the fact that industry could be dangerous because of the way that it changes how people think. I think the best way to think about how non-fiction and fiction writers in the Victorian period thought about industry and the dangers that industrialization could bring is to compare it with the way that many people nowadays, many writers and many people in general, think about the problems that increasing technology could bring. The fact that becoming digital, people being on their phones all the time, the possibilities of virtual reality and that kind of thing, the fact that people are concerned about that and people use that in literature, like that was the industry and industrialization and the mechanization of society in that way brought about a lot of the same concerns in the Victorian period as well, and that's something that Thomas Carlyle is really interested in. Next, I want to mention Charles Darwin. Darwin was born in 1809 and died in 1882. I feel like I don't need to say that much about Darwin. He is probably the most famous Victorian non-fiction writer, but obviously the origin of the species is hugely important, and his work on evolution and survival of the fittest and natural selection is really, really significant. His influence on biology and science in general was huge within the 19th century, and of course has been absolutely huge since. I realised when I was reading some of his biological writings in Victober that actually I'm not very interested in Darwin's writing. What I'm interested in is the effect that Darwin's writing had on Victorian society. I find fascinating the way that Darwin's theories affected the way people thought about religion, but also the way that people thought about humanity and what it meant to be human, because suddenly if the line between human and animal becomes very, very thin, and if humans evolve from animals, there is the possibility of humans to return to being animals. There is the implication that there is something naturally animalistic within all humans, and the way that Victorian literature explores this is really, really interesting. I'm sure I will talk about this more in a video in the future, but I've realised actually that what I find interesting about Darwin is much more the effect his writing had rather than his actual writing. But I'm sure that if you are more interested in biology than me, you will find Darwin very interesting. Next, I want to mention Charles Dickens, of course. Charles Dickens was born in 1812 and died in 1870. Obviously, Charles Dickens is most famous for being a novelist, but he also did write quite a lot of non-fiction. I haven't actually read that much of his non-fiction, to my shame, despite the fact that he is my favourite author. I really want to read some more. I still haven't read The Uncommercial Traveller. I was going to try and read it in Victober, and then it just didn't happen, but I'm hoping I will get to that at some point in the first half of this year, because I would really like to read more of his non-fiction writing. The bits and pieces I have read of his non-fiction writing I always find enjoyable, not as enjoyable as his novels, but still really interesting. You can tell from his novels how passionate he is about social criticism, how passionate he is about making the world a better place. His non-fiction is very often about this, but he also writes quite a lot about London and his interest in London and in place and just observations of other people in society. He also wrote a lot of book reviews, and he also wrote some travel literature actually. I'd really like to read his Pictures from Italy and his he wrote some kind of notes when he was in America for a while. I can't remember what that is called, but there were quite a lot of his observations on other parts of the world, and I think I would find that really interesting to read, especially because I know quite a lot about Victorian Britain, but I don't actually know that much about the rest of the world in the 19th century, so I think that's definitely on my list of things to read. More Dickens non-fiction definitely needs to be there. Next, I want to quickly mention Richard Jefferies. Richard Jefferies was born in 1848 and died in 1887. Richard Jefferies is another one that I also mentioned in my video on Victorian novelists. He was the son of a farmer, but went on to become a journalist and sometimes novelist as well. And he mainly wrote about nature and about the environment, and I think his novel and his non-fiction writings are quite interesting, especially because we always think about global warming being like a second half of the 20th century preoccupation and a 21st century preoccupation, of course, but we always think of it as quite kind of a modern preoccupation. And actually, there are quite a lot of people in the Victorian period who are also a bit concerned about how the world, the environment, the landscape might change and how industry might affect it. I'll talk a bit later about some of John Ruskin's writings on that, but Richard Jefferies is someone who kind of explores the possibilities of the landscape changing as well. Next, George Henry Lewes. Lewes was born in 1817 and died in 1878. He was a philosopher, a social critic, and also a literature critic of both books and theatre, and he was also probably most famous now for being the partner of George Eliot. Lewes left his wife in order to live with George Eliot, and they lived together unmarried for much of their lives. But he did write a lot of work of his own during his life, looking at philosophy and psychology and also some history. There was quite a big fascination in the Victorian period with the French Revolution. I've already touched on Carlyle's The History of the French Revolution, and George Henry Lewes wrote a biography of Robespierre in order to try and present him in a much more sympathetic light than he had been previously represented. Next, I want to mention Henry Mayhew. Mayhew was born in 1812 and died in 1887. Henry Mayhew is one of the most significant figures on this list. He was, in a way, I guess, a kind of sociologist. He was a social researcher. He went round Britain, and especially London, collecting first-hand spoken testimonies and information from people who were in poor situations, from people who were in dire poverty and from people in the working classes, in order to get a proper picture of what their lives were like and to try and expose the middle classes and the upper classes to the troubles that many people in the working classes suffered from. He was one of the co-founders of the satirical magazine Punch, and he also wrote a book called Labour and the London Poor, which was one of the most influential books of the 19th century and really examined the way that people who were poor lived in London. I've read several extracts from it and it's really, really interesting. A lot of it, as I mentioned earlier, is like first-hand testimonies, and it's just absolutely fascinating to read and really, really interesting. Next, John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was born in 1806 and died in 1873. He was a social critic and wrote quite a lot about politics and education, and he was an advocate of women's suffrage. I find his writing really interesting actually, because he wasn't an advocate of universal suffrage. He didn't think that working class people should have the vote, but he thought that women should have the vote, because he thought that voting was to do with education and to do with your brain. So if you weren't educated, then you didn't deserve to have the vote, but if you're a woman and you were educated, you had every right to have the vote. So not as liberal as you kind of might hope when you hear that he was in favour of women's suffrage, but actually really, really interesting to look at his kind of preoccupations and his judgment on who deserved to have the vote. Also very important and very interesting is his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill. She was born in 1807 and died in 1858. She first married a man by the name of Taylor, but they separated fairly early on, and she ended up having a relationship outside of her marriage with John Stuart Mill, who, after the death of her first husband, she later married. Harriet Taylor Mill was a philosopher and an advocate of women's rights, and although she didn't publish that much during her lifetime, it certainly suggested, and there's fairly good evidence for the fact that she contributed to and helped a lot with and occasionally co-wrote some of John Stuart Mill's publications. And she did write quite a lot during her life, and some of which was published at the time, some of which was published later. She wrote a number of essays about marriage and about women's position in society, including an essay on domestic violence. Her essay, The Enfranchisement of Women, is perhaps one of her most important, in which she examines the reasons why women should be able to vote, and also critiques not just the fact that women are denied voting, but also the fact that women are denied so many things in life. The fact that women are considered to have to be kept to their proper sphere within Victorian society, and she writes absolutely brilliantly and fascinatingly on this. We deny the right of any portion of the species to decide for another portion, or any individual for another individual, what is and what is not their proper sphere. The proper sphere for all human beings is the largest and highest which they are able to attain to. It's a really powerful essay and really important and a really significant kind of contribution to Victorian feminism. Talking of Victorian feminism, the next writer I want to speak about is Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale was born in 1820 and died in 1910. Now obviously Florence Nightingale is very, very famous for being a nurse and not famous for being a writer, but actually she wrote over 200 books, pamphlets and works during the course of her life. She was a very prolific writer as well as a nurse. Many of these books were books on nursing and manuals for nursing, but she also wrote a lot of essays on feminism, effectively, on the position of women within 19th century society. One of the most incredible and powerful of these is an essay called Cassandra, which I love. It's one of like the best bits of feminism that has been written. I mean, I probably think this because it's Victorian and I'm really interested in Victorian gender, but it's a fascinating, fascinating thing to read if you're interested in Victorian gender. It wasn't published until after her death, but it was written in 1852, and it just contains some of the most kind of heartbreaking explorations of what it was like to be a woman, especially a middle-class woman in the Victorian period. I'm just going to read you like a few random quotes from it because I want to show how powerful it is and how interesting. Why have women passion, intellect, moral activity, these three, and a place in society where no one of the three can be exercised? Women often long to enter some man's profession where they would find direction, competition, or rather opportunity of measuring the intellect with others. Women have accustomed themselves to consider intellectual occupation as a merely selfish amusement, which it is their duty to give up for every trifler more selfish than themselves. A woman cannot live in the light of intellect. Society forbids it. Those conventional frivolities which are called her duties forbid it. Dreaming always, never accomplishing, thus women live, too ashamed of their dreams which they think romantic, to tell them where they will be laughed at, even if not considered wrong. It seems as if the female spirit of the world were mourning everlastingly over blessings not lost, but which she has never had, and which, in her discouragement, she feels she will never have, they are so far off. There is perhaps no century where the woman shows so meanly as in this. And I could go on. There are so many astounding quotes in Cassandra. There are so many powerful things that Florence Nightingale is saying about the position of women within Victorian society. I just cannot recommend reading that essay enough. If you read no other Victorian non-fiction, go and read Florence Nightingale's Cassandra. And from the two most important Victorian feminists to a man who is just the opposite of everything feminist, let's talk about John Ruskin. John Ruskin was born in 1819 and died in 1900. He was an art critic as well as as an essayist, and a lot of the time he is remembered for his works of criticism on art and architecture. He also wrote some interesting things about the environment. There's a really interesting series of lectures by him called The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, where he's basically writing about what pollution is doing to the environment in a really interesting, forward-thinking way. However, despite the forward-thinkingness about kind of the effects of global warming, well, not global warming, but, you know, environmental changes, he does have some rather dubious thing to say about the position of women and men within Victorian society. Sesame and Lilies, particularly the subsection of it of Queen's Gardens, is just so difficult to read because it's so appalling. He's basically one of those 19th century writers who doesn't think that women are worse than men, but thinks that women are so different to men that it's just so patronising and awful to read. He is one of those Victorian writers who writes a lot about separate spheres, the idea that women belong in the home doing domestic, sweet, beautiful things, whereas men belong doing things. He also talks about the fact that women are much more innately moral than men, something Dickens also believes about and explores in his books. But Ruskin talks about this in a way that makes it even worse, because he basically says that women are more innately moral than men, and therefore everything that is bad in the world has to be women's fault, because it's not men's fault if they're immoral, because men are naturally immoral, whereas women who are naturally moral, if they're immoral, it's just so much worse. Oh, it's just awful, it's just awful. Let me read you some awful, terrible quotes from it. "We are foolish, and without excuse foolish, in speaking of the superiority of one sex to the other, as if they could be compared in similar things. Each has what the other has not, each completes the other and is completed by the other. They are in nothing alike, and the happiness and perfection of both depends on asking and receiving from the other what the other only can give." The problem with the idea of separate spheres is that Ruskin, and at times Dickens, but to a less awful extent than Ruskin, talks about women and men as being equal but different. The problem is when you look at equal but different, it's not equal, because the roles that Ruskin assigns to men and the roles that Ruskin assigns to women are not considered to have equal value within Victorian society, or even, to be honest, by him. Anyway, the man's power is active, progressive, defensive. He is eminently the doer, the creator, the discoverer, the defender. His intellect is for speculation and invention, his energy for adventure, for war and for conquest, wherever war is just, wherever conquest necessary. But the woman's power is for rule, not for battle, and her intellect is not for invention or creation, but for sweet ordering, arrangement and decision. She sees the qualities of things, their claims and their places. Her great function is praise. She enters into no contest, but infallibly adjusts the crown of contests. By her office, her place, she is protected from all danger and temptation. The man in his rough work and open world must encounter all peril and trial. To him, therefore, the failure, the offence, the inevitable error, often he must be wounded or subdued, often mislaid and always hardened. But he guards the woman from all this. Within his house, as ruled by her, unless she herself has sought it, need enter no danger, no temptation, no cause of error or offence. This is the true nature of home. It is the place of peace, the shelter not only from all injury, but from all terror, doubt and division. And wherever a true wife comes, this home is always around her. Oh, I really don't like John Ruskin. I really, really don't like him. Anyway, moving on from that. Next, another author I'm not especially fond of. Let's talk about Samuel Smiles. Samuel Smiles was born in 1812 and died in 1904. He was qualified as a doctor, but gave up this career to become chiefly a journalist and a writer, and he writes a lot basically about the sanctity and properness and respectability and rightness of the middle classes, why the middle classes are superior to all other classes and to pretty much everybody else, because they work hard for their money but they're also respectable, and basically because they're not lazy. That's what his arguments revolve around. His writing it's hard because on the one hand it's a very interesting critique of the aristocracy as being not deserving of their money because they haven't worked for it, which is quite interesting, but also his work is also a huge critique on the lower working classes and kind of the lower and middle working classes, people who don't have much money, saying that basically they could be middle class if only they tried harder, which is something I find very distasteful and really tricky to read about. He's one of those Victorian writers that believes that people are poor because they're lazy and because they're immoral. He's the kind of Victorian writer who I find very, very irritating for his complete kind of misunderstanding and lack of understanding for anyone in a different position to his own. He was someone who had kind of worked his way up in life, made money and become of a higher social position than the one he'd been born in. He therefore kind of assumes that everybody else could do the same. I didn't like him when I was studying an extract of his in my history module at university. I wrote in the margin, "What a fool!" exclamation mark. I stand by that. finally, on to someone I am rather more keen on. Let's talk about Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was born in 1854 and died in 1900. Obviously, Oscar Wilde is mostly known for being a novelist and a playwright, but he did also write some non-fiction essays, including one particularly interesting essay called The Soul of Man Under Socialism, which is a really, really, really interesting variation of socialism that I personally find quite appealing. I don't think it's like the kind of actual political philosophy you could really use in real life, but it's really fascinating in terms of a different use of socialism and also in terms of looking at like industrialization in the 19th century. Basically, Oscar Wilde talks about the possibility of having a future where industry and technology would mean that most jobs could be done by industry, which would mean that work would no longer be necessary. So each person, each individual could therefore pursue whatever goal they wanted in life. If they wanted to make chairs, they could make chairs. If they wanted to write books, they could write books. If they didn't want to do anything, they wouldn't have to do anything. But no work would be necessary because machines would do all the work, and therefore people could just enjoy themselves, and that this kind of equality brought around by machinery would mean that everybody would be happier. Like, it's a really lovely idea. I'm not sure that I don't think it's feasible, but it's a really nice, interesting variation on socialism, which focuses on kind of art and creativity and on people being free to do what they want with their lives. So yes, very interesting read. I think that is basically all of the non-fiction writers of the 19th century that I wanted to speak about today. I hope you have enjoyed this video on the Victorian key essayists and non-fiction writers, and please let me know if I have missed anyone out, if there's any non-fiction Victorian writers that you are interested in and that you think I should read, and let me know in the comments down below. This basically brings me to the end of the kind of introductory period of the series How to Speak Victorian. I know it's been going for a long time for this to be the end of the introduction, but I basically covered like the groundwork now. And now I'm going to embark upon a sort of series of Victorian lectures. Back in Victober, I did a video on my hypothetical Victorian literature course, and that should be starting fairly soon. There will be a proper announcement video about that up rather soon, but yes, that will be the future of How to Speak Victorian. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you very soon with another bookish video.